"I have been meaning to say this since the first snow," he said, and by then it was almost spring. Alice Collins stood at the window of the Mercantile, her fingers pressed flat against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pane in small, desperate clouds. The words Harlan Winslow had just spoken hung in the air between them like smoke from a spent cartridge, and she did not turn around. She could not turn around. If she turned around and saw his face, that face she had spent the entire winter learning to read like scripture, she was afraid of what her own expression might betray. She was afraid it would betray everything. "Say it then," she said, and her voice was far steadier than she felt. She heard him shift behind her. She heard the familiar sound of his boots on the floorboards, the low creak that happened just before the potbelly stove, the one she had memorized without meaning to. She heard him exhale, long and slow, like a man setting down something he had carried too far. Alice, just her name, just those two syllables, and still she felt them like a fist closing around her heart. She had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in the last week of October 1882, on a stagecoach that smelled of leather and unwashed men, and the particular kind of desperation that belongs to people fleeing something. She had been fleeing something. She was still not entirely certain she had outrun it. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a rough and sunburned community of cattle merchants, drifters, railroad men, and the kind of women who smiled at you carefully, as though they were rationing their warmth for the winter ahead. Alice had arrived with 2 trunks, a letter of introduction from a schoolmasters' association in St. Louis, and a dark past she had packed as carefully as her good dress, folded down small and tucked where it could not easily be found. She had not come looking for love. That was the truth she kept returning to, even now, even as Harlan stood behind her in the thin March light and prepared to say something that would change everything. She had come to escape a man named Gerald Prout, who had once been her employer and who had, over the course of 18 months, transformed from a respectable bookseller into something monstrous. She had not told anyone in Caldwell about Gerald Prout. She had not told anyone about the way her hand still sometimes shook when a man raised his voice without warning, or about the unsigned letter she had received in November, postmarked Kansas City, with nothing inside it but a single pressed black feather. She carried that secret the way she carried all her others, close to the body, tightly held, desperately hidden. She had taken the position of schoolteacher at the Caldwell schoolhouse, a single-room building with warped floorboards and windows that let the prairie wind in through the cracks. She had 22 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she loved every one of them with the fierce, surprised love of a woman who had not expected to love anything in this place. She had met Harlan Winslow on her 3rd day in town. She had been crossing the main street with an armload of primers she had ordered from St. Louis, and a horse had bolted from the hitching post outside the saloon. Some cowhand had tied it badly, or perhaps the animal was simply done with being tied, and the horse had come barreling down the street at a full gallop. Alice had frozen, which was the wrong thing to do. She had frozen with her armload of primers and her sensible shoes and her 2 years of accumulated terror, and she had stood in the street like a woman who had simply decided this was where things ended. Then Harlan had come out of nowhere. He was not a particularly large man, but he moved with the kind of economy that men who have spent years working cattle develop, a way of being exactly where he needed to be and spending no motion getting there. He had caught the horse by the bridle with one hand and pulled Alice back onto the boardwalk with the other, and the whole thing had happened so fast that Alice had not had time to feel frightened by it. She had only had time to feel the warmth of his hand on her arm, which was something she would spend the next 4 months trying not to think about. "You all right?" he had asked, and his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not consider raising it. "I'm fine," she had said, clutching her primers. "Thank you." He had nodded once, handed the horse off to a startled stable boy, and walked away without asking her name. She had asked about him at the boarding house that evening. Cordelia Marsh, who ran the establishment and who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell with the efficiency of a natural intelligence network, had told her his name, his history, and his reputation in the time it took to set the table for supper. Harlan Winslow, 31 years old, ran a ranch 7 miles east of town, the Winslow Spread, which he had built himself from a land grant after the war. His father had been a soldier who came back changed and who had died changed, and Harlan had raised his younger brother on that land with his own 2 hands. The brother, a young man named Pete, had gone east for schooling 2 years ago and now worked in a telegraph office in Topeka. Harlan was respected by the ranching community. He was known to be honest, which in Caldwell in 1882 was a rarer quality than it ought to have been. He did not gamble, did not fight unless pressed, and was considered, in the careful language of the frontier, a good man. Any woman attached to him, Alice had asked, as casually as she could manage. Cordelia had given her a look that said she was not fooled. Not anymore. There was a woman, Dora Hewitt, a few years back. She went back east, said the land was too empty for her. She had paused, setting down a bowl of beans. Some women need a crowd. Harlan Winslow is not a crowd kind of person. Alice had thought about that for a long time. The first snow had come in early November, 2 weeks after Alice arrived in Caldwell. It had come overnight, quiet and total, the kind of snowfall that transforms a rough frontier town into something almost tender. Alice had stood on the boarding house porch in the gray morning light and watched the snow cover the ugliness of the cattle pens and the ruts in the street and the weathered faces of the buildings, and she had felt, for the first time in 2 years, something close to peace. Harlan had ridden into town that morning on his buckskin horse, the animal's breath steaming in the cold air. He had seen her on the porch and touched the brim of his hat, and she had nodded back, and that was all. But there had been something in the air between them even then, a charge, a recognition, something she could not name and did not trust herself to examine. The unsigned letter from Kansas City arrived 3 days later. The black feather had been inside, just as the one before it had been. Alice had stood in her room at the boarding house, the letter in her hands, and she had felt the peace of the snowfall drain out of her completely. She had burned the letter in the small wood stove and stood watching it turn to ash, and she had made herself breathe slowly and carefully until the shaking stopped. She had not told anyone. That was her mistake, as it turned out. But she would not understand that until later, until the trap had already been set, and she was standing in the middle of it. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface than they were underneath. Alice taught her students with a dedication that was partly genuine love for the work, and partly a deliberate strategy of keeping herself too occupied to be frightened. She read to them from McGuffey's readers and from the primers she had ordered, and she taught them arithmetic and geography, and she watched the way their minds opened to knowledge, the way flowers open toward light, and it was the best part of her days. Harlan Winslow began to appear at the edges of her days in ways she pretended not to notice. He came into the mercantile on Saturday mornings when she came to collect the schoolhouse supplies. He sat in the same pew at the Sunday services she attended, 3 rows behind her and to the left. He showed up at the schoolhouse one afternoon in late November with a wagon load of firewood, which he stacked neatly against the schoolhouse wall without being asked, saying only that the wood at the schoolhouse had looked low when he rode past, and that children ought not to be cold while they were learning. She had thanked him. He had nodded. He had ridden away. She had stood watching the dust his horse kicked up until it settled, and she had told herself very firmly that she was not in a position to be interested in anyone. Cordelia Marsh, who was watching all of this from the vantage point of a woman who had lived 62 years and missed nothing, told Alice over supper one December evening that Harlan Winslow was not a man who brought firewood to schoolhouses unless there was a reason. He brought it because the children needed it, Alice said. He could have sent a hand to do it, Cordelia said. He has 2 hands on the ranch. He came himself. Alice had changed the subject. But she lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the wind on the plains, which sounded in the small hours of the morning like something searching for a way in. The second letter arrived in December, 2 days before Christmas. This one was different. This one had words. The words were, "I know where you are. I will come in the spring." Alice sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about Gerald Prout, about the way his face had changed over those 18 months, about the night she had finally understood that she was not safe and had quietly, methodically prepared to leave. She had told no one in St. Louis she was going. She had taken a position through the Schoolmasters Association under her own name because she had believed, foolishly, that Kansas was far enough. She burned the second letter as she had burned the first. Then she sat in the dark of her room and made herself think clearly. She did not go to the sheriff. She had reasons for this. Sheriff Del Oaks was a man she did not entirely trust, partly because he had a way of looking at her that made her feel like a problem waiting to happen, and partly because she had heard enough about Gerald Prout's connections. He was a man of moderate means and considerable charm, the kind of man who knew the right people to worry that the law might not be on her side as automatically as it ought to be. She thought about telling Cordelia. She came close to it several times. She did not. Instead, she spent the Christmas holiday quietly, decorating the schoolhouse for the children and attending the small Christmas Eve service at the church, and doing her absolute best to appear like a woman without secrets. She was, as it happened, an excellent actress. She had learned to be. Harlan was at the Christmas Eve service. He sat with his neighboring rancher, a man named Absalom Reed, and Reed's wife, and after the service he had come over to speak to her for the first time at any length. He had wished her a Merry Christmas with the direct, unadorned sincerity that seemed to be his primary mode of communication. She had wished him the same. They had stood in the cold outside the church for perhaps 5 minutes, talking about the school, about the winter, about whether the new year would bring the kind of rain the cattle country needed. It was the most ordinary conversation she had ever had, and she had thought about it for days afterward. January came in brutal and cold, a hard prairie winter that kept most of Caldwell indoors and made the 7 miles between town and the Winslow ranch feel like 100. But Harlan still came into town on Saturdays, and Alice still collected her supplies on Saturday mornings. They began to talk. She was not sure exactly when it shifted from polite exchange to something else, from the weather and the school and the news from the telegraph office to the kind of conversation that reveals the person behind the formalities. It happened gradually, the way rivers shift course, imperceptibly, and then completely. She learned that he had been born in Missouri and had come west at 18 with nothing but a determination that she recognized as the kind that grows in people who have learned early that no one is going to take care of them. She learned that he had read everything he could get his hands on and had opinions about books and ideas that surprised her with their depth. She learned that he had a dry humor that arrived without warning and that she found genuinely funny, which was something she had not expected. He learned things about her too, carefully and slowly, the way a man handles something he does not want to startle. He learned she was from Ohio originally, that she had studied at a women's seminary in Columbus before going to St. Louis. He learned she loved books with a passion that went beyond professional obligation, and that she had strong opinions about which Western territories were most likely to become states. He learned she made an excellent pie crust despite claiming to be a middling cook, because she brought a pie to the church social in January, and everyone agreed it was the finest they had eaten. What he did not learn, what no one learned, was that she was being followed by a man from her past, that she had received 2 unsigned letters, that she woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with her heart hammering, and lay rigid in her bed listening for sounds that did not belong to the night. It was January 23rd. She remembered the date because one of her students, a boy named Marcus Webb, had turned 9 that day, and she had given him a book of illustrated natural history. That Harlan Winslow did something that changed the texture of everything between them. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse in the early dusk, the prairie cold biting through her coat, when she had noticed a man she did not recognize standing at the far end of the main street, watching her. He was a heavy-set man in a dark coat, and he watched her with the particular stillness of someone who is doing it deliberately. She had kept walking, her pace even, her face composed, every instinct she had trained over the past 2 years screaming at her. She had walked into the mercantile, which was where she sometimes went on her way home to see if there was mail, and she had stood at the counter pretending to look at the new goods while she controlled her breathing. Harlan had been in the mercantile. He had been talking to old Garfield Brooks about some order of fence posts, and he had seen her come in, and something in her expression, she must not have been as composed as she thought, made him stop mid-sentence. He had excused himself from Garfield and come to stand beside her at the counter, not touching her, not making anything of it, but solidly present in a way she found herself grateful for beyond what she could explain. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly. "No," she said, and she heard herself say it and knew it was inadequate. He did not push. He did not ask questions. He simply stayed. He walked her to the boarding house that evening. It was the first time. He talked about the fence posts he had ordered, and about a problem he was having with a water line on the north pasture. Ordinary practical things. And she listened and contributed and felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. At the boarding house door, he said, "I'll be in town again Thursday." It was not quite a question, she said. "I'll be at the schoolhouse until 4. He nodded once. That was all. On Thursday he appeared at the schoolhouse at 3:30, hat in hand, and helped her carry a stack of readers back to the mercantile for storage, and then walked with her to the boarding house, and the heavy-set man in the dark coat was nowhere to be seen, and Alice felt safer than she had in months. The routine established itself organically, without either of them naming it or declaring it. He walked with her on Tuesdays and Thursdays when he was in town, which was most weeks, and on Saturdays after she collected her supplies. They talked. They talked about everything and nothing, books and cattle, and the politics of the territory and the characters of Caldwell, and the philosophical question of whether civilization on the frontier was something that was being built or something that was being imposed. He had thought about these things in ways that startled her, alone on his ranch over long winters, and she found his mind as interesting as anything she had encountered. She was falling in love with him. She knew it. She acknowledged it to herself clearly and without illusion, which was the only way she knew how to deal with things she could not control. She was falling in love with Harlan Winslow, and it was the worst possible time for it, and she had not the faintest idea what to do about it, because the man from her past was still out there, and spring was coming. In the second week of February, she saw the heavy-set man again. This time he was on horseback, moving slowly through the cattle pens on the south side of town, and this time he was watching the boarding house rather than the street. Alice saw him from her window, and her blood went cold. She watched him for 2 hours, methodically and without moving, until he rode away east. That evening she sat down and wrote a letter to the Schoolmasters Association in St. Louis, asking about the possibility of a transfer. She wrote it, addressed it, and held it in her hands for a long time. Then she put it away without sending it. She told herself it was because she had responsibilities to her students. She told herself it was because running had not worked the first time, and there was no reason to think it would work again. She told herself practical and rational things until she ran out of them, and then she sat in the quiet of her room and admitted the truth. She did not want to leave Caldwell. She did not want to leave Harlan. She had been careful, so careful, not to want things that could be used against her. She had learned that lesson, but it turned out that caution was not enough to prevent the heart from making its own calculations. The following Tuesday, walking back from the schoolhouse with Harlan in the thin February light, she made a decision, not to tell him everything, not yet, but to tell him something. "I need to ask you something," she said. He turned to look at her. She noticed not for the first time that he gave people his full attention when they spoke, a quality so rare it still surprised her. "There's a man," she began, and she felt the words resist her, all the old training toward silence fighting her. "I don't know his name. I've seen him twice, a heavy-set man in a dark coat. I think he's watching me." Harlan was quiet for a moment, not in the way of a man who had nothing to say, but in the way of a man who was choosing what to say carefully. "How long?" he asked. "I first noticed him in January." "Do you know who sent him?" She hesitated. "I have a suspicion." He waited. He did not push. "There's someone from before I came here," she said. "I left a situation in St. Louis that was complicated. I thought I had left it far enough behind." She could feel him absorbing this, cataloging it with the same methodical care he brought to everything. "Have you told Del Oaks?" he asked. "No." A pause. "Any particular reason?" "I don't fully trust him." Another pause, and then, "Neither do I," he said, and his tone was so matter-of-fact about it that she almost laughed. "What should I do?" she asked, and she hated how much she needed to ask it and was grateful at the same time that she could. "Stop walking alone after dark," he said. "Keep your window locked, and tell me if you see him again. That's it. For now. Unless you want to tell me more about who you're running from." She looked at him then, full in the face, which she usually rationed carefully because looking at Harlan Winslow's face directly for more than a few seconds had a disorienting effect on her concentration. His expression was steady and open. No judgment in it. Just the kind of patience she associated with men who had learned to wait out hard winters. "Not yet," she said. "All right," he said. And that was all. He was as good as his word. He began coming into town more frequently, on days that had no stated purpose, passing the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, arranging to be present without making it obvious. She appreciated the discretion. She appreciated that he did not ask her more questions than she was ready for. She appreciated his quiet, steady presence in a way that was becoming, she realized, quite essential to her daily equilibrium. She also appreciated, in a more complicated and less comfortable way, that she had no idea what he actually felt about her. He treated her with consistent warmth and with a respect that was almost scrupulous in its carefulness. He was attentive without being intrusive. He made her laugh. He sought her opinion on things and listened to it with genuine interest. But he had not said anything that went beyond the lines of ordinary friendship, and she did not know if this was because he did not feel anything beyond friendship, or because he was as careful as she was. Cordelia Marsh, who had an opinion on everything and kept none of them to herself, informed Alice in mid-February that the whole of Caldwell had formed various opinions on the subject of Alice Collins and Harlan Winslow, and that the general consensus was that they were both being ridiculous. "I don't know what you mean," Alice said. "Yes, you do," Cordelia said. "That man has been finding reasons to be in town twice as often as he needs to be since November, and he spent 30 years finding no reasons at all. Everyone can see it except the two of you, which is typically how these things go." Alice said nothing. "I saw Dora Hewitt," Cordelia said, almost casually. "The woman he was with before. She wrote to me at Christmas. Did I tell you that?" "You did not." "She's in Philadelphia now, married a banker. She says she still thinks about Kansas sometimes. Says she wonders if she made the right choice." "People always wonder," Alice said. "Some things are worth staying for," Cordelia said, and went back to her sewing. Alice turned this over in her mind for days. The trap, she would later call it that, because it was precisely that was set on a Friday evening in the last week of February. She had stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing for a presentation one of her older students was giving the following week, a 13-year-old girl named Sophie Abrams who wanted to give a reading from a book of poems she had discovered and who had asked Alice to help her prepare. Alice loved Sophie Abrams with a particular fierceness, because Sophie reminded her of herself at that age, hungry for things she did not have the words for yet, stubborn in the way that would either break her or make her extraordinary. She had lost track of time. It was past 6 when she finally locked the schoolhouse and started for town. The sun was already gone, the sky the particular deep blue of prairie twilight, and the cold was the serious cold of February dark, the kind that gets into your bones within minutes. She had gone perhaps a quarter mile when the man stepped out of the shadows beside the cottonwood trees that lined the creek road. He was not the heavy-set man in the dark coat. This was a different man, younger, with quick eyes and a jacket that had seen better days. He held his hands out from his sides in a gesture of openness that she did not trust. "Miss Collins," he said. She stopped. She assessed. She did not run because there was nowhere to run to on an open road in the dark, and because running would confirm she was afraid, and she had learned that confirming fear to predators was never a good strategy. "Who are you?" she said. "Name's Tidwell. I carry messages." He reached into his jacket and she braced, and he produced an envelope sealed, her name on it in handwriting she recognized immediately. "From a gentleman who wants to arrange a meeting." "Tell that gentleman," Alice said, her voice steady as she could make it, "that I have no interest in meeting him. He said you'd say that. He said to tell you that if you don't come of your own free will, he'll make trouble for you here. He knows people. He said you'd understand what that means." She did understand. Gerald Prout knew people everywhere. He was the kind of man who cultivated useful connections the way other men cultivated gardens with patience and intention. "Where does he want to meet?" she asked, not because she intended to go, but because information was valuable. "Bingham's old trading post 2 miles east tomorrow night." Tidwell held out the envelope again. "He thought you might want the details in writing." She took the envelope. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked the rest of the way to town without running, which was one of the harder things she had ever done. Harlan was at the boarding house when she arrived, which was not something she had expected, and which later she would understand was the kind of providence she had stopped believing in but apparently could not stop benefiting from. He was speaking to Cordelia on the porch, and he saw her face as she came up the walk, and he was off the porch in 2 strides. "What happened?" he said. She took the envelope out of her pocket and handed it to him. She watched him read it. She watched his face, which remained mostly still in the way she had come to understand was his version of controlled emotion rather than absence of it. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes she had not seen there before. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and colder and considerably more dangerous. "Tell me," he said, and she told him. All of it. Gerald Prout and the 18 months in St. Louis and the way things had changed, and the night she had understood she had to leave, and the letters and the feathers, and the man in the dark coat and all of it, pouring out of her in the cold February night on the porch of Cordelia Marsh's boarding house, while Cordelia stood in the doorway with her hands clasped and said not a single word. When Alice finished, she felt hollowed out and strangely light, the way people feel after a fever breaks. Harlan folded the envelope carefully and put it in his own pocket. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, not understanding. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to deal with this," he said. "Harlan." She used his first name, which she had been doing for weeks now, but there was an urgency in it now. "This is not your problem to deal with. I don't want you in the middle of I'm already in the middle of it," he said, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before, direct and unguarded in a way he was almost never direct and unguarded. "Whether you put me there or not." She stared at him. He pulled back from the edge of whatever that was and returned to practicalities, which was his way. He said he was going to talk to Absalom Reed, who had 2 reliable men working for him and who Harlan trusted completely. He said he was going to find out more about the heavy-set man and where he was staying. He said he was not going to let Alice walk anywhere alone until this was resolved. She wanted to argue. She had been taking care of herself for 2 years, after all, and she had fierce opinions about not becoming someone's dependent. But she was also honest enough to recognize that she was frightened in a way that was past her ability to manage alone, and that Harlan was offering help that was genuine and not conditional, and did not come with the implication that she owed him anything. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He said good night to Cordelia. He rode away in the dark, and Alice watched him go, and Cordelia put a hand on her shoulder and steered her inside. What followed was 3 days of careful, quiet, ruthlessly efficient maneuvering that she was only partly privy to. Harlan and Absalom Reed's men, whose names were Charlie Birch and Tom Odom, both reliable cowhands with good judgment, established that the heavy-set man in the dark coat was staying at a roadhouse 5 miles south of Caldwell, and that his name was Clement, and that he was, as far as anyone could determine, a hired man who tracked people for money. This information was obtained by Charlie Birch, who had a gift for conversation in establishments where drinking was done, and who reported it to Harlan with impressive specificity. Harlan went to see Clement. Alice never found out exactly what was said in that meeting, and when she pressed Harlan for details later, he deflected with the particular economy of a man who considers certain things settled and not in need of elaboration. What she knew was that Clement left the area within 24 hours of the meeting and was not seen again. She also knew, because Charlie Birch was not quite as discreet as Harlan, that Harlan had told Clement that any further contact with Alice Collins would be a decision Clement would regret in specific and concrete ways. She found, upon reflection, that she was not troubled by this. The larger problem remained. Gerald Pruitt's note had proposed a meeting. If Alice did not come to the meeting, and if Clement was no longer available to relay messages, Pruitt would either come himself or would find another means of pressure. This was not a man who accepted defeat easily. She knew that about him better than she knew almost anything else. It was Harlan who proposed the solution, on a Wednesday evening in early March, sitting in Cordelia's parlor with Cordelia strategically absent on an errand that Alice suspected she had invented. "You need a lawyer," he said. She looked at him. "Pruitt's leverage is that you're alone out here," he said. "Isolated. No family, no connections. He knows that. He's counting on it. A lawyer changes that. A lawyer means documentation, formal channels. Men like Pruitt don't like formal channels. They like shadows." "A lawyer in Kansas can't help with what happened in Missouri," she said. "A lawyer in Kansas can write very specific letters to very specific people in Missouri," he said. "About a businessman who used his position to harass and threaten a woman in his employ, about the circumstances under which she found it necessary to leave." He paused. "I know a man in Wichita, Frank Delaney, honest lawyer, which is not as common as it ought to be. He's helped 3 families I know of with complicated situations." "This would cost money," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not say anything else. She looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was offering. She also understood that accepting it changed things and that she needed to be clear-eyed about that. "I'll pay you back," she said. "Everything. I'll put it in writing." "No," he said quietly and firmly. "Harlan, friends help each other out," he said, and there was something tight around the word friends, some quality of restraint in it that she noted and filed away. "We can argue about the terms later," she said. "All right," he said, which was his way of agreeing to disagree and moving forward, and which she had come to recognize as a kind of endearment in itself. He wrote to Frank Delaney that week. Delaney came to Caldwell in the second week of March on the train from Wichita. A compact, precise man with a reputation that preceded him, and a manner that was brisk without being unkind. He met with Alice for 2 hours at the Mercantile's back office, which Garfield Brooks made available with the unquestioning helpfulness of a man who respected Harlan Winslow's judgment. Delaney listened to everything she told him, asked precise and intelligent questions, took careful notes, and then told her what he intended to do. He was going to contact certain associates in St. Louis and begin gathering documentation. He was going to send a letter to Gerald Pruitt, on official letterhead, notifying him that his behavior constituted harassment, and that any further attempt to contact, approach, or coerce Alice Collins would result in formal action. He was also going to contact the Schoolmasters Association to formally establish her standing and contract in Caldwell, creating an official paper trail that made her presence in Kansas legally solid. "Will this work?" Alice asked. "Men like this," Delaney said, "rely on the isolation of their victims. They are frequently not as bold as they seem when the lamp is turned on them." He paused. "It may not work immediately, but it changes your position considerably." She thanked him. He departed the following morning. She should have felt better. She did feel better in a rational and architectural way. The structure of her defenses had improved. But she was also exhausted in a way that went below the physical, and she was increasingly aware, with spring beginning to breathe on the edges of the prairie, that the suspended state she had been living in could not continue indefinitely. She had been in Caldwell for 4.5 months. The first snow had come 2 weeks after her arrival. And since the first snow, something had been building between her and Harlan Winslow that neither of them had named, that they circled around with the careful caution of two people who had both been burned and did not want to be burned again. She was almost certain he felt it. She was also almost certain he was waiting for something. Whether he was waiting for her to be safe, or for the right moment, or for her to give some signal she had not realized she was withholding, she could not determine. She was tired of waiting. She was tired of secrets and hidden motives and the carefully maintained distance between what she felt and what she was willing to say. She had spent 2 years hiding, and Caldwell and this man had made her want to come back out into the light. She did not know exactly what the light looked like or whether she was brave enough for it, but she was tired of the dark. It was on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March, 3 days after Frank Delaney's visit, that she went to the mercantile to collect a supply order she had not actually placed, which Cordelia Marsh told her afterward was as transparent a pretense as she had ever witnessed. The mercantile was quiet in the late afternoon, just old Garfield behind the counter and the smell of coffee and tobacco and sawdust. Harlan was there, which she had counted on but not been certain of, talking to Garfield about a cattle shipment. He turned when she came in and she saw him register her expression, that quick, careful attention of his. She said, "Could I speak to you?" And Garfield became immediately and conveniently occupied with something in the back room. And that was how they came to be standing in the thin March light of the mercantile, her at the window with her hands against the glass and her breath fogging it, and him behind her with whatever he had been meaning to say since the first snow. "I have been meaning to say this since the first snow," he said, and by then it was almost spring. She turned around. His face was open in a way she had only seen glimpses of before, the careful reserve set aside, all of it visible, the steady, particular affection that had been building in him all winter, the uncertainty, the wanting, and underneath all of it the thing that made it precious rather than terrifying, the honesty of it. He was not performing anything. He never performed anything. "I think you know what I mean," he said, "but I've been letting things get in the way. The situation with Prout, which I didn't want to pressure you when you were already dealing with a threat. And before that, I wasn't sure. About what you wanted, about whether you were planning to stay." "I'm planning to stay," she said. Something shifted in his face. "I love this school," she said, and then, because she was tired of being careful, "and I have feelings about this place, and about you, that I have not said because I have spent 2 years being very careful about what I say and what I trust, and old habits are difficult." "I know something about old habits," he said. "I imagine you do," she said. They stood looking at each other in the afternoon light, and outside on the street a wagon went by and someone called out to someone else and a horse stamped, and the world of Caldwell, Kansas went about its business as though nothing of particular importance was happening in Garfield Brooks's mercantile. "I want to court you," Harlan said, "properly, if you're willing." The word "properly" in his mouth was somehow both formal and entirely warm, as though he understood that she needed the structure of something stated and acknowledged and real. "I'm willing," she said. He exhaled. She realized he had been holding his breath. And then he smiled, which was rare enough from him that she had catalogued every instance of it, and this one was different from the others, wider, less guarded, genuinely delighted, and she felt something unlock in her chest that she had not even known was locked. "All right then," he said. She laughed. She could not help it. It came out of her surprised and genuine, and he laughed too, a sound she had heard only once or twice before and had been storing carefully. They stood in Garfield Brooks's mercantile laughing like two people who had earned it. Then he held out his arm and she took it, and they walked out into the March afternoon and the early smell of the turning season and the whole open, uncertain, necessary future of it. What followed was the most tender and improbable spring Alice Collins had ever lived through. Harlan courted her with the same methodical sincerity he brought to everything, and it turned out that methodical sincerity was, in Alice's particular constellation of needs and preferences, the most romantic thing she had ever encountered. He brought her books from the supply catalog and asked her opinion before he ordered them, which meant she got to talk about books for hours at a time, and he listened with genuine interest. He took her driving on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, out across the prairie in his wagon with a blanket for her lap and the vast Kansas sky opening above them in every direction. He introduced her formally to his ranch, which she visited for the first time on a Sunday in early April. It was a practical, well-kept spread, nothing fancy but nothing neglected either, the kind of place that reflected the steady character of the man who ran it. There was a good-sized house with a broad porch, a solid barn, a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show the first green of the year. He showed her the horses, who were exceptionally well cared for, and the water line on the north pasture that he had been working to fix all winter. She stood on the porch of his house and looked out at the prairie and thought, "I could live here." The thought arrived so naturally and completely that she stood with it for a moment, surprised by its simplicity. After 2 years of running, of holding everything loosely in case she needed to drop it and run again, the idea of simply living somewhere, of putting down roots in specific ground, was almost radical. She told Cordelia about the visit that evening. Cordelia listened with the expression of a woman watching a story arrive at the chapter she had always expected. "He showed you the whole property," Cordelia said, "more or less." "He's showing you what he has to offer," Cordelia said. "That man does not do things without a reason." Alice thought about this. She thought about Harlan's measured way of moving toward things, not impulsive, not reckless, but not timid either, always purposeful. "Cordelia," she said, "are you under the impression he's going to propose to me?" "I'm under the impression," Cordelia said, "that man has been moving in that direction since he first saw you, and that everything that has happened this winter has been a detour, and that now the road is clear again." Alice went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and did not feel afraid of any of the thoughts she was having. The news from Frank Delaney arrived in the second week of April. Gerald Prout had responded to Delaney's letter. He had, apparently, consulted his own legal counsel and been advised that further pursuit of the matter was unwise. He had agreed in writing to cease all contact with Alice Collins. He had also, Delaney noted in his letter to Alice, quietly settled a separate matter that had apparently been pending in Missouri regarding his conduct as an employer, the details of which Delaney did not share but which Alice understood were probably related to her situation, and possibly to other women she had not known about. She read Delaney's letter twice, carefully, and then she sat very still for a while. 2 years. 2 years of looking over her shoulder, of keeping herself ready to run, of sleeping lightly and trusting no one, and carrying the weight of a secret she had never asked to be burdened with. And now, apparently, it was over. She folded Delaney's letter and held it in her lap and waited to feel something conclusive. What she felt instead was a slow, warm unspooling of tension, like a rope that has been pulled too tight for too long finally being released. It was not dramatic. It was immensely, privately relieving. She rode out to the Winslow ranch that afternoon, which was something she had not done alone before, and found Harlan replacing boards on the north fence with the focused competence he brought to physical work. He saw her coming and set down his tools and came to meet her at the gate. She handed him Delaney's letter without a word. He read it. His expression did not change much, but she had become very good at reading the subtle language of his face, and what she saw was a specific quality of relief that mirrored her own. He handed the letter back. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood at the gate in the April afternoon, the new grass beginning to show pale green on the prairie, the air smelling of thaw and distance. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She had the sudden, clear knowledge of what was coming, and she felt every muscle in her body simultaneously tighten and relax in a physiological response that was probably absurd and certainly involuntary. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Longer than a while. Since around the first snow, honestly, though that was too early and I knew it was too early." He paused and she could see him choosing his words with care the way he always did. "I'm not good at making things sound like more than they are. I know that about myself, so I'll just say it plain." "Plain is good," she said. Her voice was impressively steady. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I want you to come here and live on this place and build something with me. I think we're well suited to each other, and I think what I feel for you is the kind of thing that doesn't diminish. And I think you're remarkable, and that's not a word I use loosely." She looked at him for a long moment. The April wind moved through the new grass. A meadowlark called somewhere to the south, the first she had heard that spring. "I love you," she said, because it was true and it was time, and because she had decided at the beginning of this conversation that if it went where she thought it was going, she was not going to be careful about this. She was going to say it directly and without qualification. "I love you, and yes, yes, I'll marry you." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, something that was close to wonder. Then he took her hand, which he had not done before, and held it with a deliberateness that was entirely like him, not grasping, not impulsive, just certain. "Good," he said, and it was the same word he had used for the letter, but the way he said it was completely different. She laughed again as she had laughed in the mercantile, helpless and genuine. He smiled that rare wide smile. The meadowlark called again, and the prairie opened around them in every direction, immense and full of possibility, and Alice Collins stood at the gate of the Winslow ranch and felt, for the first time in 2 years, completely and irreducibly safe. They were married in June. It was a June wedding at the Caldwell church, which turned out to be more of a community event than either of them had quite planned for, because Caldwell was a town that took its social occasions seriously, and Harlan Winslow getting married was, by everyone's reckoning, an occasion of the first order. Cordelia Marsh organized the reception dinner with the efficiency of a military general and considerably more warmth. Absalom Reed and his wife sat in the front pew and wept, which no one had expected from Absalom, who was not generally considered a sentimental man. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, the finest fabric she had ordered from the catalog, and she carried wildflowers from the prairie because there were no florists in Caldwell and wildflowers seemed right anyway, prairie flowers for a prairie life. Harlan wore his good suit, which she had not seen before, and the sight of him in it did something quite extraordinary to her composure. He stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that made her understand, with a clarity that was almost physical, that this was a man who intended to love her with the same steady and absolute devotion he brought to everything he cared about, and that she was about to stake the rest of her life on that understanding, and that she was entirely at peace with it. The ceremony was read by Pastor Elias Brown, who was both brief and sincere, which Alice appreciated. She made her vows in a clear voice and meant every word of them. He made his in that steady, quiet tone that was entirely his own, and she felt each word land like something permanent. When the pastor pronounced them married and Harlan kissed her for the first time, unhurried and with characteristic deliberateness, the assembled population of Caldwell erupted in a noise that startled the horses tied outside and was probably heard at the Winslow ranch 7 miles away. Life on the ranch was different from anything she had experienced before, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that she loved it. She continued teaching. She had not been certain, when the question of the school arose, what would happen, whether the school board would expect her to leave her position upon marriage, as was common in many places. She had prepared arguments. Harlan had quietly prepared different arguments. As it turned out, the school board of Caldwell, faced with the reality that good teachers in the Kansas Territory were not common, and that Alice Collins was an exceptional one, voted 4-1 to allow her to continue, with the one dissenting vote cast by a man named Hargrove who disapproved of progress on principle and was mostly disregarded. She rode the 7 miles to town 3 days a week on a bay mare Harlan had selected for her with care. A steady, intelligent horse he had called Patience before Alice renamed her Clementine, which Harlan accepted with the mild resignation of a man who recognized a lost argument. On the other 2 school days she stayed in town with Cordelia, who had insisted on maintaining a room for her with the firmness of a woman who knows when an arrangement benefits everyone. The first year of their marriage was full and complicated and sometimes difficult, and in the deepest and most essential way, the happiest of Alice's life. She learned the rhythms of ranch life the way she had learned everything, with focused attention and the willingness to be wrong before she was right. She learned to read the weather on the prairie, which was a constant and urgent text. She learned the particular communication system of cattle and horses, which was less mysterious than she had expected and more nuanced. She learned to cook for a man who worked physically hard and needed real food, rather than the careful, modest portions she had made for herself in her boarding house years. And she discovered along the way that she was actually a considerably better cook than she had told him. She also discovered things about Harlan that life on the ranch revealed in ways that their careful winter courtship had not. She discovered that he was a man who woke early and worked late, and did not complain about either. She discovered that he had a deep affection for the land he had built on, not the sentimental affection of a man who romanticizes the frontier, but the particular love of someone who has put his hands in the dirt and made something grow. She discovered that he was funny in ways she had not fully appreciated, that his dry humor sharpened at home in a way it only partially did in public, and that making him laugh had become one of her primary daily objectives. She also discovered that he was, in private, considerably more expressive than his public reserve suggested. That the careful, measured man the town of Caldwell knew was the same man who, in the kitchen of their ranch house, would put down whatever he was doing to come stand beside her when she was reading something she wanted to share, who would listen with his full attention and then say something about it that revealed the depth of thought he had been doing all along. He told her, in the 2nd month of their marriage, about his father. He did not tell her all of it at once. It came in pieces over time, the way hard things do when they are trusted to someone. His father had come back from the war in 1865, changed in ways the family had no language for and no help with, and had gradually become a man of silences and sudden violences that were directed, primarily, at walls and furniture, and the land itself rather than at people, but which had made the house a place of held breath and careful footsteps. His father had died in 1871 when Harlan was 20 and had left him the land and Pete, who was 7, and a determination that things would be different. Different how? Alice asked. Quieter, he said. Steadier, he paused. I spent a lot of years being very controlled, because I'd seen what happened when a man was not. She understood then, with greater clarity than she had had before, what his reserve actually was. Not coldness, not withholding, but the deliberate, earned calm of a man who had made very specific choices about who he intended to be. She loved him more for understanding it. She told him more about Gerald Prout, too. Not just the facts she had given him in February on Cordelia's porch, but the texture of it, the way it had happened gradually, the way she had not seen it clearly until it was already bad, the months of self-doubt that had followed her out of St. Louis and ridden with her on the stagecoach and taken up residence in her. The way she had told herself she should have known sooner, handled it differently, been stronger. You left, Harlan said. That was the strong thing. I ran, she said. You left, he said again, with the particular finality of a man who has decided where the truth lies. She leaned her head on his shoulder, which was something she had recently started doing and which she intended to do for the rest of her life. "Your brother is coming for Christmas," she said, changing the subject to something she was looking forward to. "He's coming Thanksgiving," Harlan said. "I told you twice." "You told me once," she said, "and not very clearly." "I told you clearly," he said. She lifted her head to look at him. He was already looking at her, that steady gaze with the warmth behind it that she had learned to read from the beginning, and she understood that they were not really arguing about Pete's visit. They were just talking, in the way that people who love each other talk, with the absolute security of people who know the other person is not going anywhere. Pete Winslow arrived for Thanksgiving with the energy of a young man of 23 who has been working in a telegraph office and is desperately glad to have open space again. He was shorter than Harlan, more openly exuberant, with the same quality of basic honesty, but expressed in a more immediate and verbal way. He and Alice liked each other immediately and thoroughly, which visibly relieved Harlan in a way he tried not to show and failed. They spent 4 days eating well and talking about everything and playing cards in the evenings. Pete was an enthusiastic, if strategic card player, and walking out on the prairie in the cold November air that was beginning to carry the suggestion of winter. On the last evening of Pete's visit, he sat with Alice at the kitchen table while Harlan brought in extra wood, and he said, quietly and without preamble, "He's happy." "He's actually happy. I wasn't sure he knew how." Alice looked at him. "I was worried about him for a long time," Pete said. "After everything, he was so alone out here. He wouldn't say so, but he was." He paused. "I wrote to him last spring and asked him if there was anything going on, and he wrote back about the water line on the north pasture." She laughed. "Thank you," Pete said simply, "for whatever you did." "He did the work," she said. "I just got out of the way of it." Harlan came back in with the wood, looked at the two of them with mild suspicion, and was told by Alice that they had been discussing the water line. "That line's fixed," he said. "I know," she said. "Very impressive." He gave her the particular look that meant he knew she was teasing him, and that he had decided not to dignify it, which was one of her favorite of his expressions. Pete left the following morning on the early stage, waving from the window with his hat, and they watched the stage go until it was gone. The second winter was gentler than the first, or perhaps Alice had learned to love the prairie winter in a way that made it different. She loved the stillness of the snow on the open land. She loved the way the ranch house was warm inside against the cold outside, and the particular satisfaction of that contrast. She loved sitting at the kitchen table with papers from her students, while Harlan worked at the opposite end with his ledgers, two people in companionable proximity to separate thoughts that occasionally intersected in productive ways. In January of 1884, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Harlan on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table, passing the news across the space between them as directly as she had ever told him anything, because she had found that directness was always better than ceremony, and that he received things best when they were given plain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came around the table and kneeled beside her chair in a gesture she had never seen from him, that was entirely unlike his habitual self-containment, and took both her hands, and she understood that whatever the right word was for what she saw on his face, it was not something she could adequately describe. It was joy. It was gratitude. It was the face of a man who had spent a long time building a life in an empty place and could now see that the place was filling up. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. He raised her hands and held them against his face for a moment, which undid her completely. Their son was born in August of 1884, on a blazing prairie afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer, and the meadowlarks called from the creek, and the doctor from Caldwell arrived in time, barely, to manage the business with commendable efficiency. They named him William James Winslow, William for no particular family reason, but because it was solid and dignified, and James for Alice's father, who had been a good man and who had died before she left Ohio, and whose absence she still felt on important days. William turned out to be a person of considerable opinions from the beginning, which Alice found charming and Harlan found both characteristic and mildly alarming, as it seemed to portend a future of significant negotiation. He was a healthy, vigorous child who found the ranch immediately interesting in the way that children find anything they can touch and climb and get dirty with interesting. He had Harlan's eyes and Alice's stubbornness, and an additional characteristic stubbornness that appeared to be his own invention. He began talking early and did not stop. Harlan, who had spent much of his life in deliberate quietude, adapted to this new state of constant small-person commentary with a bemused grace that Alice found enormously endearing. Sophie Abrams, Alice's student who had done the poetry reading, finished her time at the Caldwell School and went on to a women's seminary in Kansas City, which Alice had helped her apply to and which Sophie had earned on her own considerable merit. Alice received a letter from Sophie in the fall of 1884, written in the precise hand Alice had spent 2 years helping her develop, full of wonder and intellectual excitement, and she sat with that letter for a long time feeling the particular satisfaction of a teacher who knows the work was worth doing. She was still teaching. William came with her on Tuesdays and Thursdays, small and opinionated, and the older students took turns minding him while the younger ones were instructed, and this arrangement worked with the improvised efficiency that frontier living generally demanded. In the spring of 1885, a letter came from Pete. He was leaving the telegraph office. He had met a woman in Topeka, a woman named Rachel, a schoolteacher, and they were getting married in June, and he wanted to know if there was land available near the Winslow spread, because Rachel was a woman who wanted to be on the prairie, and he had discovered that he wanted what Harlan had, a piece of ground and a life on it. Harlan read the letter twice, put it on the table, and went out to stand on the porch. Alice followed him. He was looking east across the ranch, at the land that extended beyond his north fence, where there had once been a homestead claim that had been abandoned 3 years ago and whose land had been available since. "The Brennan place," she said. "I know," he said. "You've been thinking about it." "I've been thinking about it." She stood beside him. The spring prairie was spectacular in the evening light, the new grass very green, the air carrying the smell of the creek and the wild plum trees that grew along it, the meadowlarks doing their persistent and magnificent business. "Write to him," she said. He wrote to Pete that week. Pete and Rachel came to Caldwell in June 1885, married here at the same church where Harlan and Alice had married 3 years before, and moved into the old Brennan place, which Pete had been fixing up all of April with help from Charlie Birch and Tom Odom and Harlan himself. Rachel Winslow turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to Caldwell, which was a high standard given the preceding developments. She was a woman of clear intelligence and generous spirit, who took to ranch life with a practical fearlessness that delighted everyone and who became, within a year, one of Alice's closest friends. They would ride out together on Sunday afternoons when both families gathered, which they did most Sundays, the sound of the two households together filling the prairie air. Alice discovered, in the winter of 1886, that she was expecting again. This time she told Harlan over breakfast on a Wednesday morning with characteristic directness, and he received it with the same quality of quiet, particular joy as the first time. William, now 2½ and deeply invested in all family matters, was informed somewhat later and responded by asking if the new person would be able to play with him immediately, and was disappointed by the timeline. Their daughter was born in July of 1886, on a considerably calmer afternoon than her brother had chosen, arriving with what Harlan described as efficiency and Alice described as mercy. They named her Clara Ann Winslow, Clara because Alice loved the name and Ann for Cordelia's middle name, which Cordelia pretended not to be moved by and demonstrably was. Clara turned out to be a person of quieter demeanor than her brother, which did not mean she was less formidable. From very early she had a watchful quality, an attention to the people around her that felt considered rather than passive, and which Alice recognized as something she had seen before. She had seen it in her husband on a winter day 4 years ago, when a man she barely knew had turned and given her his full attention, as though she was the most important thing in his immediate world. "She has your eyes," she told Harlan, looking at their daughter sleeping. "She has your expression," he said. "Which one?" "The one you have when you're figuring something out," he said. She looked at him. "You get very quiet," he said, "and then you say exactly the right thing. She'll do that. You've decided this from a 3-week-old infant." "Yes," he said, with the serenity of a man entirely committed to his assessment. Cordelia Marsh turned 65 in 1886 and began, in the gentle and gradual way of someone who has been working hard for decades, to slow down. Her boarding house had been the social center of Caldwell for 20 years, and the idea of it ending felt to Alice like the loss of something structural, like a wall coming down in a building she had considered permanent. But Cordelia did not stop. She simply changed the scale of things, taking in fewer boarders and spending more time with the people she loved, including Alice and Harlan and the children, who she treated with the benevolent authority of a woman who had decided to be a grandmother by force of will if not by biology. William adored her. He would sit on her porch for hours, listening to her stories of Caldwell's early days, the cattle drives and the railroad and the rough years before things had settled into something more like civilization. Clara, when she was old enough to sit still for it, listened with the same focused attention. Alice would watch this and feel a layered gratitude that she had learned to receive without questioning gratitude for Caldwell, for the community it had become, for the people in it. In 1887, Alice received a letter from Sophie Abrams. Sophie had finished her studies. She had been offered a position teaching at a school in Lawrence, Kansas, and she was taking it. She was also engaged to be married to a young man who taught mathematics and who, she wrote, had the extraordinary quality of listening to her when she talked about literature without looking at her like she was doing something inadvisable. Alice read this part 3 times and felt very fond of the unknown mathematics teacher. She wrote Sophie back a letter that was 8 pages long and covered everything from practical advice on teaching to what she knew about Lawrence to the particular satisfaction of marrying someone who lets you talk about the things you love. Sophie wrote back within a week, and a correspondence began that would last for many years. It was in the fall of 1887 that Harlan told her about the additional land. He had been considering it for months. She understood. In the deliberate way he considered everything important, turning it over before bringing it to her because he wanted to come with a fully formed plan rather than a half-formed one. The land east of the Brennan place, Pete's place now, had come available through a different set of circumstances, and there was also a section north of the creek that had been in dispute for 2 years and had finally been resolved. "We could expand the herd," he said, "or lease some of the north section. Either way, the ranch becomes more secure than it already is." She asked. "I want to build something that lasts," he said, with a simplicity that she recognized as the core of him, the man who had come at 18 to empty land with nothing, and had refused to build anything he was not certain of. "Then let's do it," she said. He looked at her with the expression she loved best, the one that was rare enough to be precious, the wide, unguarded look of a man who had not expected to be met so directly and was deeply glad of it. The expansion took the better part of 2 years. Charlie Birch, who had been working the Winslow spread since before Alice arrived, was made foreman, a position he accepted with the quiet dignity of a man who had been doing the job informally for years, and was glad to have it acknowledged. 2 additional hands were hired, young men from families in the area, good workers who needed steady employment, and who added, in their way, to the small ecosystem that the ranch had become. Alice watched Harlan manage all of this: the men, the land, the cattle, the logistics, with the admiration of a person who sees someone doing the thing they were made for and doing it excellently. He was a good employer, which in the West meant something specific. He was fair with wages, demanding but not cruel, the kind of man whose expectations were clear and whose word was reliable. The men who worked for him stayed. That said everything. She was still teaching. By 1888, she had been teaching in Caldwell for 6 years, and the school had grown, and she had become, in the way of teachers who stay long enough, a fixed point in the community's sense of itself. She knew 3 generations of some families. She had taught older siblings whose younger siblings were now in her class. She had attended the weddings and funerals and celebrations that marked the passage of time in a small town, and she had been marked by them in return. She loved it. She loved it with the same surprised, fierce love she had felt in the first weeks, a love that had only deepened as she understood what she was part of. She was part of the making of something, not just the educating of individual children, but the building of a community that had the intelligence and capacity to survive itself, to become something more than a cattle town at the edge of the Kishom Trail. One evening in November of 1888, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Harlan in the cold that was beginning to bite with the seriousness of coming winter, William and Clara in bed and the prairie dark and enormous around them, she said, "Do you remember telling me you'd been meaning to say something since the first snow?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him smiling even though she was not looking at him. "Yes," he said. "It was almost spring by then," she said. "You waited a long time." "I waited until I was certain," he said. "I don't say things I'm not certain of." "I know," she said. "That's one of the things She paused. "One of many things." He reached over and took her hand, which was bare because she had taken off her glove, and his hand was warm from his coat pocket. "I was certain in December," he said. "By the first snow I already knew, but I told you it was too early, and then you were in danger and I was not going to add to what you were carrying. So you waited. So I waited." She turned to look at him. In the November dark, his face was the face she knew better than any other. The face she had been reading for 6 years and still found capable of surprising her, which she considered one of the essential requirements for a long and interesting life with someone. "What would you have done," she said, "if I had said no?" He considered this with the gravity he gave to hypothetical questions, which was the same gravity he gave to real ones. "Gone home," he said, "continued as I was," a pause, "been considerably less happy about it. And you would never have mentioned it again," she said. "Would you? You would have gone back to being my friend and never said another word." "Probably," he said. "That is a maddening quality," she said. "Yes," he agreed, without any indication of intending to change it. She leaned into him, which she did, which she intended to do forever. The cold was serious now, the kind that came off the open prairie with nothing to stop it, and she was warm against his side. And above them the Kansas sky was full of stars in the particular abundance that only becomes visible far from city lights, a display so extravagant it still moved her even after 6 years of nights beneath it. "I was going to leave," she said. "You know that. In February, when the second letter came, I had almost written to the association asking for a transfer." "I didn't know that," he said. "I didn't send it," she said. "I held it and then I put it away." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. She had told herself practical reasons at the time: the students, the contract, the futility of running again. All true, but not complete. "Because of you," she said. "Because something had started and I did not want to leave before I knew what it was." She felt him take a slow breath. "I'm very glad you didn't leave," he said, in the quiet, certain way he said things that mattered. "So am I," she said. The winter of 1888 came in with the same white abundance as the winter of 1882, the same transformation of the rough and sunburned landscape into something almost gentle, the same way the snow covered the ugliness and left the bones of the country clean. Alice stood at the kitchen window of the ranch house on the morning of the first snow of that year and watched it come down, and thought of standing on Cordelia's boarding house porch 6 years before in her first week in Caldwell, afraid and determined, and not yet knowing what the place held for her. Harlan came up behind her and put a cup of coffee in her hand and stood beside her at the window, and they watched the snow together. And Clara's voice came from upstairs asking if there would be school today, and William's voice said there wouldn't because it was Saturday, Clara, in the tone of an older brother whose expertise on scheduling is absolute. 6 years, she said. Since the first snow, he said. Since the first snow, she agreed. She turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was everything they had built, the ranch and the school and the children and the community, and the 6 years of mornings and evenings and difficult days and good days, and the whole accumulated weight of a life that was exactly as real and solid and rooted as she had spent 2 years in terror of never having. He took the coffee cup gently from her hand and set it down, and he kissed her with the same unhurried deliberateness as the first time at their wedding, and then held her in the kitchen with the snow coming down outside and the children arguing about Saturday in their authoritative way upstairs, and she pressed her face into the side of his neck and felt his heartbeat, steady as always. She thought, I could have run. I almost ran. I almost missed this whole extraordinary thing. She thought, thank God for the winter that held me here long enough to know. 2 more years passed with the steadiness of good things, marked by the rhythms of the ranch and the school, and the seasons and the small events that accumulate into a life. William started school, at Alice's school, which produced a complicated institutional dynamic that the other students found enormously entertaining, and demonstrated the same fearsome appetite for information that his mother had at his age, combined with the same capacity for independent assessment that characterized his father. He was, from his first day, a difficult and wonderful student. Clara at 3 was a child of considerable gravity and considerable warmth, who had begun to show the specific quality of attention that Harlan had identified early. She would listen to something, and then, in her own time, say exactly the right thing about it. At 3, this primarily involved the household animals and the garden, but Alice could already see the person she was going to be. In the spring of 1890, Frank Delaney wrote from Wichita. He was writing, he said, on a matter of some delicacy. He had been approached by a woman in Kansas City who was attempting to leave a difficult employment situation and had heard, through channels he did not specify, that Delaney had helped someone in similar circumstances several years before. He was not asking for anything specific, simply whether Alice would be willing to write a letter that might assist this woman in understanding her options. Alice read the letter twice. She sat with it at the kitchen table. Harlan across the table with his ledgers watched her. She told him what it said. He waited. I'm going to write the letter, she said. Yes, he said. I thought you would. I want to do more than that eventually, she said. There has to be more that can be done, not just individual letters, something more organized. He looked at her with that particular expression, the one that meant he was hearing her and taking it seriously and would think about it and come back to it. There are women doing that work, he said, organizations in the eastern cities. Kansas is not entirely without options either. I know, she said. I want to be part of it. He nodded once, which was all she needed. She wrote the letter to Delaney. Then she wrote a second letter, to an organization in Topeka that Rachel had mentioned. Rachel had connections through her own teaching network to a group doing advocacy work for women in difficult circumstances. The correspondence that followed was extensive and took months, and ultimately resulted in Alice becoming a corresponding member of the Topeka Women's Aid Society, which did practical work helping women access legal resources and safe housing. It was not everything. It was something. Harlan, without making anything of it, cleared a portion of his contribution to the church's charitable giving for the society. When she thanked him, he said he thought it was sensible. She kissed him on the cheek, and he appeared mildly startled and considerably pleased. The decade turned. 1890 brought Kansas closer to the statehood conversations that had been going on for years, and the territory hummed with political argument that permeated every social gathering and Sunday dinner. Caldwell, as a cattle town with railroad connections, had strong opinions about tariffs and water rights, and the always-present question of who the land actually belonged to, a question that Alice was careful to bring her full historical knowledge to in the classroom, because the children of Caldwell were growing up on land that had been someone else's before it was theirs, and that deserved to be spoken plainly. Harlan had opinions on the politics that were typically well-informed and direct. He was elected, without particularly seeking it, to the county commission in 1891, which required him to go to Wichita 3 times a year, and which he approached with the same methodical honesty he brought to everything. He was not a naturally political person, which made him, Alice observed, a better politician than most naturally political people. Sophie Abrams came to visit in the summer of 1891, with her husband, the mathematics teacher, whose name was David, and who turned out to be exactly as Alice had imagined from Sophie's description. A quiet, precise man with a genuine and unpretentious intelligence, who talked about Euclidean geometry at the dinner table with the same passion Alice's husband talked about water rights, and who fit into the company of the Winslow table with the ease of someone who has been somewhere many times before, even though it is their first visit. Sophie was a woman now, 22, with the confidence of someone who has done what she set out to do and found it worth the effort. She and Alice sat on the porch on the evening of the second day of the visit, the prairie night very big around them, and Sophie said, "You saved my life, you know, teaching me like you did." Alice protested, as she always did. "No," Sophie said firmly, with the stubbornness Alice had always loved in her. "I came from nothing, Miss Collins." Alice said. They had had this particular conversation several times. Alice: "I came from a farm family with no books and no ambition for me beyond what my mother had, which was a husband and a good garden. You showed me what else there was. You did that." Alice was quiet for a moment. "You showed yourself," she said. "I just had the books." Sophie smiled, which was a smile that reminded Alice powerfully of the 9-year-old who had first sat in her classroom, bright and fierce and full of wanting. "You had more than books," Sophie said. The visit ended 2 days later, David and Sophie on the morning stage, waving as Pete had waved years before from the stagecoach window. Alice watched them go and felt the particular bittersweet quality of the send-off, the gratitude of having had the visit and the small ache of the parting, which she had learned to recognize as simply what it meant to love people. She turned back to the ranch, where William, now 7, was doing his absolute best to convince his father to let him help with the morning feeding, and Clara, 4, was watching a meadowlark on the fence post with the focused attention of a future naturalist or philosopher. And the summer morning was opening around them all, and the ranch was hers, and the school was hers, and the life was hers, solidly, irrevocably, beautifully hers. In the winter of 1892, she discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She told Harlan in the same direct way as always, and he received it with the same quality of joy, which had not diminished through repetition, and which she found she was still moved by, still genuinely grateful for, as though each time she told him good news he proved again that he was the person she had believed him to be. Their 2nd son was born in July of 1892, a boy they named Thomas Absalom Winslow Thomas for no particular reason except that it was a good, strong name, and Absalom for their neighbor and friend, who had been there since the beginning of things and who wept again at the naming, which was becoming, Alice observed, something of a tradition. Thomas arrived with the same blazing prairie summer that had attended his brother's birth 8 years before, and was from his first hours a child of remarkable placidity, the complement, Harlan suggested, to William's considerable volume. Where William had opinions about everything, Thomas appeared to be taking in information, storing it, deciding what to make of it later. "He's like you," Alice told Harlan. "I hope not entirely," Harlan said, which was the closest he ever came to self-deprecation. "Why not?" she said. "Entirely would be excellent." He gave her the look. She smiled at him over the baby's head and felt full of a happiness that was not the bright, surprised happiness of things being better than expected, but the deeper, quieter happiness of things being exactly what they should be. Cordelia Marsh came to see the baby the following week, making the trip out to the ranch with the determined mobility of a woman who refused to let 69 years slow her down appreciably. She held Thomas for 20 minutes, told Alice he had good lungs and excellent color, told Harlan he had done well, which covered everything Cordelia considered necessary to say, and then stayed for supper and told stories about the early days of Caldwell until William fell asleep at the table and Clara had to be carried to bed. She left with the evening stage and they stood on the porch watching her go, and Alice felt the specific mix of love and worry that Cordelia's advancing age produced in her, the awareness that Cordelia was a fixed point she had always counted on and that fixed points eventually moved. But not yet, not for a long while yet. The years that followed were the years Alice had sometimes, in the worst of her 2 years in St. Louis, tried to imagine as a way of holding on the years of ordinary, specific, irreplaceable life. The children grew. William became, at 10, the kind of student who was simultaneously the teacher's delight and the teacher's challenge, which his mother navigated with the unfair advantage of having taught him since birth. Clara at 7 had her father's quietness and her mother's interior life, and was beginning to read with the voraciousness that Alice recognized as the first sign of a reader, which is to say, someone who will never quite be bored and never quite be alone. Thomas at 3 talked to the horses with the seriousness of someone conducting real conversation, and the horses appeared to take him seriously in return, which Harlan said was good judgment on their part. Pete and Rachel had children of their own by now, a son named Joseph and a daughter named Me, and the Sunday gatherings at the Winslow Ranch had expanded accordingly, 2 families' worth of children running between the 2 properties and filling the prairie with a quantity of noise that Alice found not just tolerable but deeply, specifically pleasing. This was what the land had been waiting for, she thought sometimes. Not just to be worked, but to be lived on. Not just cattle and crops, but the particular human noise of people who belong to each other and to a place. In the spring of 1895, she received one final letter that bore on the old matter. It came not from Gerald Prout, who was by all available information still in St. Louis, presumably a smaller and more cautious version of the man he had been. Frank Delaney's letters had had their effect. She had always believed that, but from a woman she had known in St. Louis, a woman named Margaret Hollins who had worked in a different establishment on the same street and who had occasionally exchanged words with Alice in those years. Margaret's letter said that Gerald Prout had died in February of that year, of a cardiac episode, and that she thought Alice should know. She said she did not know if this was welcome news or not, but that in her experience people tended to want to know. Alice read this letter on the porch of the ranch house in the April morning, with the meadowlarks calling and the new grass coming in and the smell of the creek and the wild plum trees carrying on the air. She sat with the letter for a while. She felt a complicated thing that was not celebration and was not grief, but was something more like the completion of a sentence that had been left hanging for too long. She folded the letter carefully. She went inside and found Harlan in the kitchen where he was looking at something that needed doing with the North Water line, which in 13 years had been the subject of more conversations than any other single topic on the ranch. "Gerald Prout is dead," she said. He looked up. He watched her face carefully. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She thought about it. "Yes, I am." She paused. "I have been all right for a long time. I'm just also glad to know." He nodded. He came to her and put his arms around her in the plain, certain way he had always held her, and she leaned into him and let the old shadow of the thing finish dissolving. "It's over," she said. "It's been over," he said, "for a long time." "I know," she said, But now it's official. She felt him laugh, that rare, genuine sound against her hair. She pulled back and looked at him. 44 years old now, and the lines that the Kansas sun put in a man's face were there, and the threads of gray at his temples, and he was still entirely himself. The same steady, direct, unhurried person who had pulled her off a street in October of 1882 and then walked away without asking her name. "I love you," she said, because she still said it and he still received it with the same quality of being genuinely glad. "I love you," he said, plain and certain. They stood in the kitchen of the ranch house they had built together, in the state of Kansas on an April morning in 1895, with 3 children asleep upstairs, and the prairie outside the window beginning its annual resumption of the enormous, gorgeous business of spring. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done, and the life ahead of them was as open as the land they stood on. Later that afternoon, Alice rode out to the north pasture, where William was helping Charlie Birch with some fence work, a thing he had taken up with the seriousness of someone who understood he was being trusted. She watched her son working the post with concentration and competence, 12 years old and already showing the particular quality of focused effort that she recognized from his father. Clara was at the ranch house with Thomas, and Thomas would be helping Rachel at the neighboring farm, and Pete would be out with his own cattle, and all of it was going, all of it was fine. She turned her horse and looked east, out across the ranch and beyond it to the open prairie where the sky came down to meet the grass, and the distance went on longer than you could see. And she thought about a stagecoach arriving in late October, and a young woman with 2 trunks and a dark past, and no idea what she was riding into, and the way that particular woman had stood on a boarding house porch in the first snow of winter and felt, briefly, something close to peace before the world came crashing in again. And then the spring, and then all the springs after it. She thought about the first snow and what had already been decided in it, invisibly, before either of them had the courage or the safety to say so. She thought about how long it had taken, the whole winter between the first snow and almost spring, and how it had been exactly the right amount of time, how they had needed every day of it to find their footing, to build the trust that made the rest possible. She thought about secrets and their weight, and about what it meant to put them down. She thought about the specific courage it takes to stay when every instinct says to run, the harder and more essential courage of choosing a place and committing to it, of deciding that this ground, this person, this life, was worth defending instead of fleeing. She thought about the meadowlark, that first morning of almost spring, calling from the south. She turned her horse back toward the ranch house, toward the smoke from the kitchen chimney that meant Cordelia was visiting, and had taken over the cooking, which was always a mixed blessing and entirely welcome, toward the sound of Thomas's voice from the barn where he was in conversation with his horses, toward home. 12 years from the first snow, and still the seasons turned on the Kansas prairie with the same enormous indifference, and still the land required the same patient, steady tending, and still the life she had almost not chosen kept revealing itself as the best and realest thing she had ever stumbled into. She rode through the gate of the Winslow ranch and dismounted and led Clementine to the barn, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the afternoon, listening to the meadowlark. Harlan came out onto the porch. He watched her walk up from the barn, the way he had watched her walk up from wherever she had been any number of times over the past 12 years, and the quality of that watching had not changed. It was the same attentive, particular regard that she had noticed without understanding in those first winter months, the look of a man who is paying attention because someone is worth paying attention to. "Supper in an hour," he said. "Cordelia is in charge of the biscuits." "Good," she said. "I'm starving." She came up the porch steps and he held the door for her, which he had always done, and which she had always accepted as the specific gesture it was. Not ceremony, not condescension, just the consistent, physical expression of a man who wanted to make things easy for the people he loved. She went inside, into the warmth, into the smell of Cordelia's biscuits, and the sound of the children beginning to assemble, and the ordinary, extraordinary music of her life. And the prairie ran on outside in the last gold of the afternoon, immense and uncontained, all the way to the horizon and beyond it, out to where the sky comes down and everything becomes possible.